parts 1 to 3 of this film, we've described, albeit briefly, the outline events of the Falklands land battle. Now in this final part, a few of our participants are going to cover one or two particular aspects of the campaign and consider their greater significance. And we selected one or two subjects which, although they're covered as much as possible in peacetime training, rarely only come to life in the fog of war. And they include command and control of the operation, the psychological business of casualties, and leadership at the front. And we'll start at the top with General Moore. Now, before he went south to become the Commander of Land Forces, he was Land Deputy to the Commander-in-Chief Fleet at Northwood, who was, of course, the overall operational commander. And as such, he had a big responsibility for the planning of the operation. And it was perhaps the most complex operation undertaken by British troops since Suez in 1956, which was, of course, a far more accessible target. Furthermore, most of the commanders, down to and including company commanders at Suez, had wartime experience, and the Falklands was very different. So what lessons does General Moore have for us from his experiences, both at Northwood and in the Falklands?
In my first involvement with the command of the land forces then, I was the advisor to Admiral John Fieldhouse. I did that job partly because I'm the Marine commander who normally worked with the fleet headquarters, and partly, of course, because I'm a professional amphibious soldier. It was therefore appropriate that I should be the chap who gave the advice to the Commander-in-Chief and indeed to the Chiefs of Staff and the War Cabinet where appropriate. I stayed at Northwood, continuing that task, up until the time that the decision had been irrevocably taken to proceed with the landing. And I'm sure that that was right. I then moved south, but how was I to do this? I could have flown to Ascension and then on and parachuted to the task force in the way that Colonel Chandler did. But I decided not to do that, partly because I felt that maybe I'd be on the back of the forward brigade commander because I would have no troops to add and use to assist his battle, and partly because it seemed to me a rather over-dramatic way for a general to go to war anyway. So instead, when I got to Ascension, I sailed in QE2. But that was wrong. For those 8 days, the Commander-in-Chief had to get his information from Brigadier Thompson. Brigadier Thompson wasn't known to him, and vice versa. And Brigadier Thompson was trying to fight a battle and should not have been having to devote a great deal of his attention to the business of reporting back what things looked like. That is a job that I could and should have done had I been there. When I arrived, I was able to take that over. But up to the time that I arrived, I felt, and still feel, that I was providing the support I should have neither to my Commander-in-Chief nor to my forward brigade commander. And that was my major mistake of the campaign.
Now command and control at brigade level. General Thompson, as commander of the 3rd Commando Brigade, was responsible for the planning and conduct of both the amphibious assault landing and also the first phase of operations. Now, what lessons does he have for us?
With the advantage of hindsight and time to reflect on the operation, clearly there are several things that I would have done differently, though at the time I did what I did because I thought it was right. And the most important lesson that emerged for me was the need to send the right level of force to do a job. And when it became apparent that the operation on Darwin and Goose Green was to be more than a raid, I should have gone down there in person to take command of it and taken down with me another commander or battalion to make it a 2-unit battle with me in personal command, and I did not. I should also have had more artillery, The problem with the artillery was how to get it down there. And we obviously had to do it at night, because if we'd flown guns down there in daylight, we would have signalled our intention to the enemy. And the third point to do with that battle was I should have sent the armour down. I didn't, because I feared that it would get bogged down on the way down there, and I would end up with my armour bogged in on the way to Goose Green with no means of extracting it. And on that same note, armour, I should have had with me a squadron leader from the armoured squadron. I should have asked for him to come. I didn't. I could also have asked for more armour, which might have made me less chary about using the 2 troops that I had. And the lesson there is, if you don't ask, you don't get. The fourth lesson that I learnt, and I could almost say I didn't learn it, I knew it already, was the importance of logistics. You can have the best plan in the world and the best trained troops in the world, but if when they arrive on their objective they've got no ammunition to shoot at the enemy, no food to eat or no fuel for generators, which I might add didn't happen, but it did constrain me in my planning, then you'll find that your logistic plans drive your tactical plans. You can have the cleverest plan in the world, but if your logistics aren't right, they just won't work.
Next, we turn to support helicopters. In his post-operational report, the Commander 3 Commando Brigade wrote as follows. The support helicopters were flown superbly, with great determination and courage, better than I've ever seen. Conversely, the commander-controller support helicopters was the worst that I've seen in any operation or exercise in 29 years of soldiering. Now, that's a pretty strong indictment. What went wrong, and what have we got to do in order to put it right? Of course, there were factors which were peculiar to the Falklands, but then surely that's true of every single operation. With General Thompson, who will expand upon the statement that he made just after the operation, is Wing Commander Stables, who commanded the Chinook Squadron and who has many years of experience of flying support helicopters with the Army.
When I wrote that report, I had a number of incidents in mind. And just to give you a few examples, there were occasions when helicopters were on the ground doing nothing when they were wanted desperately badly forward. There were occasions when helicopters were put into great danger where the pilots clearly weren't clear where the enemy exactly was, and that's bad briefing. And there were occasions when not enough helicopters were put onto tasks and they took far too long. I'm sure this all comes back to the fact that there isn't a helicopter commander forward with the brigade commander in the way that the sapper and gunner that I'm used to having in my pocket, to coin a phrase, is, and where they are in the mind of the commander and can anticipate after a certain time working with him what he wants to do, so they almost know what he's thinking before he thinks it himself. So the helicopter squadrons, instead of reacting to the situation all the time, are actually participating in the planning process, concurrent activities taking place, and they can actually bend the plan, if necessary, in a certain way so that it's to their advantage and they can play their part in the best possible way.
I think there are 2 important factors here. One is liaison oblique command, and the other one most certainly is communications. There are also, I think, differences between my operation now in support of one British Corps, where we are a Corps asset, against this out-of-theatre operation, where clearly the opportunity to send a flight commander or even the commander forward to be a part of the staff is much readily available. Clearly in the Corps area, in support of one British Corps, it would be impossible to spread my assets so thinly around. But indeed, I accept the principle, and it's absolutely right, that we must, as airmen, give the ground force commander the best possible service, and that service must include the best possible advice available at the time.
Yes, well, I'm very glad to hear that. I think the main thing, Tony, is that he ought to be a pilot. If you can't put the commander of the helicopters forward and you decide to put a fairly senior LO, he must be a pilot, because he must be someone who the squadron or squadrons will trust to represent their views at the planning process, and when he comes back to them and says what we're going on with now, they won't turn around and just fill the whole air with hollow laughter because he's given them bad advice.
I would go even further than that. I think it's not only has it got to be a pilot, it's got to be one who is only just removed or in current flying practice on that type of aircraft that we're operating in that type of environment.
Yeah, well, we're agreed then.
The reality of casualties is, of course, a factor of war. And in this area, the Falklands campaign proved to be very different from the experiences of the British Army in Northern Ireland, where incidents are over so quickly, where they're usually unrelated to one another, rather than part of a prolonged battle, and where hospitals are only a few minutes away. It was very different for somebody wounded, for example, on Mount Longdon, and one of these was Corporal Bailey. With him are Colonel Keeble and Surgeon Commander Jolly. Corporal Bailey.
We prepared to move across some open ground to take out a position. As we moved across, I was shot in the hip and went down. I saw stars and it all went black for a time. When I came to, I decided I was going to try and move into some type of cover. As I moved, I was later shot in the neck and the hand. The position I'd been fired from was later taken out and I got some shrapnel in the same wound in the hip. As people got to me when they'd taken out the position, they then tried to find out where I'd been hit. They were reassuring me and trying to find out where the exit wound and entry wound was. In the hip, the entry wound is exactly the same as the exit wound, so it made quite a large hole. They put field dressings on this to stop the bleeding. They ripped open my trousers to put in the morphine into my leg. When it came to the neck, they again were looking for the exit and entry wound. There was only one wound. It went straight across the back of the neck. They put field dressings across the back of the neck to stop the bleeding and to keep it clean. With the hand, they just put my hand inside my smock. Once at Teal Inlet, they put me into the old schoolhouse where they had a quick look at my injuries, stripped off all my clothes so they could have a good look, put a blanket over me and then put me into a tent outside where there was other people waiting. The whole of the rest of the day went past now until it was night time, where they then put me on a helicopter and flew me out to the Uganda. On the Uganda, they took me straight into intensive care. While in intensive care, they had a quick look at my wounds again, assessed that I needed to get into the operating theatre straight away, took me inside and then started to close up my wounds.
In 2 Para, the single most important principle we had to get over to the battalion was the primacy of the mission. It had to take priority over every other aspect on the battlefield, including casualties. Now, so as we didn't have a morale problem, we built a 4-tier system to deal with casualties. We were not dealing simply with first aid. What we wanted to do was battlefield resuscitation. And so the 4-tier systems applied firstly to the individual. We taught him to treat himself and not to just cry medic and drag somebody else off the battlefield who was attempting to achieve the mission to deal with him. He was of secondary importance. Secondly, we had a medic in every section. Thirdly, we had 2 or 3 medics at company level and then some better trained ones at battalion. And in this way, the soldiers could be certain that they were going to be looked after if they got hit. Now, in addition to this system, we also equipped every soldier with morphine, field dressings, and a half-litre of Hartmann solution, a fluid, so that he went into battle with the life-saving aids to keep him alive if he got hit. And in this way, we managed to keep people alive so that when we came to evacuate them, they were evacuated not at the whim of the casualty to suit his needs, but at the whim of the commander. And when we got them back to the field surgical team, because we had kept them alive and we had resuscitated them correctly, there was no delay in their subsequent surgery.
And the proof of that particular pudding came for 2 Para with the Battle of Goose Green, a fierce infantry engagement fought throughout a long day over open rolling ground in which the medics could simply not get to the injured, and this system of self-support came to the fore. Throughout the Falklands campaign, particularly with the Royal Marine Commandos and members of the Parachute Regiment, I was astounded to see just what sort of injuries fit young men could take and still survive. After Goose Green, there were men coming in pale, with bluish tinges around their lips, who required 4 or 5 units of blood, which they had donated themselves a week before landing, for resuscitation. Following that transfusion of half a gallon of blood, the wounds would start to bleed again, you had something to stop, and then take them to surgery. It is also a tribute to the presence of the surgical teams, airborne or commando trained, very far forward in the evacuation chain. In Goose Green's case, Ajax Bay was about 6 minutes flying time away. With devoted surgeons close to the front line, good availability of blood, a good battlefield resuscitation system, and above all, fit young men at the point of wounding, this incredible track record was achieved.
There is another aspect to this question of casualties, and that is the psychology of fear. There were 3 devices we used to sustain the soldier on the battlefield. The first was the spiritual support which we derived from the regimental system. The second was the fact that we had the initiative. We were going to attack and they were going to have to defend. And the third was the contribution the Padre made in taking every section and voicing the fears that they would have on the battlefield. He talked about casualties, about death, and in that way drew out their fears from them in order to prepare themselves for the onslaught to come.
The successful application of these principles of training showed in the extremely low psychiatric casualty rate. In the Army and in the Royal Marines, we are used to the fear of death from a sniper's bullet or from an explosion in Northern Ireland. The Falklands was an unpleasant situation with a hostile enemy air force and long-range artillery. But I'm sure those principles would apply just as much to the opening barrage of a Central Front campaign.
It's often said that the battalion that patrols well will do anything else well. And the value of good patrolling was admirably displayed during the Falklands campaign, both in acquiring the information necessary for commanders in formulating their plans, and in undermining the self-confidence and thereby the fighting quality of the opposition. And this was perhaps particularly true for the attacks on Mount Longdon and Mount Harriet. Colonel Pike commanded 3 para for the attack on Mount Longdon. Sergeant Collins carried out some invaluable patrols in the preparation for the attack on Mount Harriet, and they're now going to take up the subject of patrolling, and in particular deal with the coordination and battle procedure required.
As a commander responsible for the planning of patrolling, I found myself constantly confronted by quite a difficult dilemma. On the one hand, fatigue was always a factor very much in the front of my mind, and no single activity was more tiring and more physically demanding than patrolling. Furthermore, any patrolling carried with it the risk of casualties, and that I had to take into account as well, bearing in mind the battles to come. On the other hand, of course, there was the absolute necessity to acquire the detailed tactical information on enemy positions and minefields and so on, which we needed in order to plan.
As a patrol commander, it was important to me that I was given enough time to carry out proper battle procedure. This meant the receiving of a detailed briefing, then overlooking the ground from an observation point. During this time, I was able to record artillery defensive fire tasks and have a good look at the ground I was going to be covering during the night's patrol. After this, I had enough time to assess the situation and decide in detail what my plan would be, then to give a detailed set of orders to the men of my patrol. During the patrol itself, I agree with Colonel Pike about fatigue, but also you have to consider fear. I found myself lying in the cold and the wet, having to weigh fear and fatigue against the importance of carrying out the aim of my patrol. Fire support was also important. Having spent time pre-recording fire tasks prior to the patrol, I was able to use fire support to distract the enemy and allow me to close in to the lower slopes of Mount Harriet. I also used it again to extract myself from that exposed position. After the patrol, I always made sure I debriefed my men in detail, and then I myself was debriefed in turn by both my int officer and my CO.
Sergeant Collins is quite right to stress this matter of debriefing. It was of very great importance, both within each patrol and, of course, the debriefs by the intelligence officer and, if necessary, by the commanding officer. As far as the planning of patrolling was concerned, we learnt a very early lesson when two of my companies each sent out a fighting patrol, and the one clashed with the other as a result of a serious map reading, serious but basic map reading error by one of the officers commanding one of those patrols. As a result of this very hard lesson, which caused us 8 casualties, I decided to use my patrol company commander, a major, and his headquarters to command and coordinate and plan all the patrolling that my battalion did. Patrolling, in my view, is an acid test for the junior leader. And in the final analysis, of course, the very survival of that patrol will depend on how well he, as a strong leader, maintains high standards of battlefield discipline within that patrol.
Colonel Pike has alluded to the importance of the junior leader, and our final subject for discussion must be the level at which the battle is won, as it always will be won and lost, at company, platoon and section level. Major Kisley of the Scots Guards, Lieutenant Waddington of the Parachute Regiment, and Corporal Newland of 4-2 Commando. And there came a moment for each of them when the buck stopped very firmly with them. Why? Corporal Newland.
Basically because the men on the other side of the hill were getting all sorts thrown at them and we were getting nothing. And I was the only section in a safe-ish position at the time that could give them any kind of aid. So the message came over the radio that they needed somebody to go and sort out some snipers. Now that had only to be me because I was the only one with the radio and knew what was going on. Plus, in our line of work, you can't detail a man off to risk his life and limb on something that you know more about than he does, so it had to be me. Plus, the other thing is, you feel a real ball of anger at this stage because they're your friends who are getting all sorts slammed into them. So you redirect that anger and then act accordingly. And I can remember after I was hit, when my section got to me, the anger they could feel because somebody had had the audacity to shoot me, there was no way on this earth anybody could have stopped them from doing what they did, which was redirect their own anger and slam back into the enemy as hard as they could.
I can understand the anger Corporal Newland felt when his friends were being shot and killed on the far side of the hill. As my platoon were approaching Goose Green, we attacked a lone building, and as we crossed the open ground, one of my youngest soldiers was hit by shrapnel from an anti-aircraft gun. Unfortunately, he was not killed outright and received a very painful wound into his spine. He lay there in the open ground with the rest of the platoon around him, and obviously he was in excruciating pain. Everybody turned round to look at him. No one was concerned with the battle at that stage. Everybody was concerned with the suffering of their friend who was there in the middle. There's nothing we could do. I at that stage forgot what I should have been doing as a platoon commander and moved back to see how he was, to see if I could do anything. When I got there, the medic and my platoon sergeant were doing as much as they could. I looked down at him and I got very angry indeed. Very angry with the people who would do this kind of thing to my platoon and to one of my soldiers. And so I took the rest of the platoon, as many as I could, and without thinking really, we just moved round and we tried to get into a position where we could attack the schoolhouse. Fortunately, as I moved round, I kind of calmed down and realised I'd got more people's lives to think of. Therefore, I did a bit more of an appreciation. Unfortunately, I joined in with our patrol company, and together we moved in and we took out the schoolhouse.
Yes, I think at the company commander level, you're very much part of that anger because you probably motivated it in the first place, a very necessary part of battlefield motivation. But you've also got to be sufficiently detached to be able to turn it off at the right time. Perhaps the crudest analogy, turning a tap on and off. And I think if you don't know when to turn it off and you're not sufficiently detached to do so, it just turns into brutality. I remember a particular time in the battle when I was a little too far forward and became very much involved, personally and directly, in this anger, and realizing that I was out of place and realizing that I was too closely involved with it. I remember a little voice in the back of my mind saying, "Don't get mad, get even. Don't get mad, get even." I think there was certainly a time that I realized that the buck was stopping with me, or certainly that responsibility was resting with me, lying at the foot of Mount Tumbledown during the attack, and hearing the commanding officer over the radio telling me firmly but very calmly that dawn was fast approaching, and that before dawn not only had my attack got to be completed, but another company had got to pass through me to take the rest of Tumbledown, that the Gurkhas had to take the whole of Mount William, and the Welsh Guards to take Sapper Hill, and that the whole of the Falklands War was drawing to a standstill just because Kisley wasn't getting a move on, although he didn't put it like that. And balancing that against the knowledge of exactly what I wanted to do, which was to wait until artillery fire could be coordinated with my company attack, but the judgment that if I tried to make a hasty and rushed attack before that had been accomplished, all I'd be doing is throwing men's lives away, really to no end, no avail, and we wouldn't achieve the aim at all. I think at that stage I knew that responsibility rested with one man and one man alone. I know you felt exactly the same at Goose Green.
Yes, the moment I realised the full weight of responsibility which rested on my shoulders was during my first contact outside Goose Green. Within a few minutes I had lost one soldier with a stomach wound, and the rest of my platoon were pinned down in a little gully by sniper fire. The radio was completely gaga by that stage, and I turned around and I saw that the rest of the platoon were all looking at me, waiting for an order. I was very confused myself, but I realised I had to do something, anything, just to get the platoon moving. So I told my one-section commander to move his section out of the gully and put fire down, and as soon as he started moving, everything flowed from there.
I suppose, thinking about it, as a leader in the army, one's life is held just on trust for the day when one may be called to account to actually do the job one's paid to do and forfeit it. And I think that probably means leading from the front.
From my point of view, all the people at the back are just directors, and all leaders lead from the front.